Today we'll be discussing Chapter 2 of Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics on the grammar and etymology of the word being. We ended Chapter 1 with a clear-eyed but lamentable acknowledgement of the destroyed relation in which the West stands to being. One of the central signs of this is that we can barely even acknowledge that being represents anything at all. To us, it's almost a meaningless word. Heidegger proposes to begin the second chapter with an attempt to explore what remains of intelligibility and meaning in the word being, however paltry this may be. So he says in the opening of the chapter, if for us being is just an empty word and an evanescent meaning, then we must at least first try to grasp fully this last remnant of a connection. So we ask to begin with, 1, what sort of word is this anyway, being, as regards its formal character as a word? 2, what does linguistics tell us about the original meaning of this word? The linguistics that Heidegger has in mind is basically the study of grammar and etymology. So there are two distinct scholarly issues here that he mentions. The first is, what is the grammatical structure and status of the word being? That's the first question. What is the grammatical structure and status of the word being? The second question is, what is the etymology of the word being? Where did it come from? What is the etymology of the word being? Where did it come from? Notice now with both of these questions, we've actually sidestepped the question of being and have instead diverted our attention to discussing the word being. So we're now in the domain of linguistic and grammatical analysis. In this chapter, Heidegger is going to confine himself to investigating the meaning of the word being, starting by following the expected conventional path for investigating any word, namely to investigate its grammar and its etymology. The result of this chapter will be twofold. First, the grammatical examination of the meaning of the word being reveals that the infinitive from which it originates blurs the word's meaning. The grammatical examination of the word being reveals that the infinitive from which it originates blurs the word's meaning. And second, the etymological examination of the meaning of being shows that there are three distinct sources that are blended together in such a way that none of these is evident on its own in the meaning of the word anymore, according to Heidegger. So the grammatical examination reveals the infinitive that blurs the word's meaning, and the etymological examination reveals three sources, but these three sources are blended in such a way that none of them is evident in the meaning of the word anymore. So you can see that the conclusion of this linguistic, grammatical, etymological investigation of the word being is going to merely reinforce the way in which Western man is alienated from being because the word itself is defective. So it's going to be a kind of a negative dead end at the end of this chapter. However, that does not mean it's fruitless and should just be skipped over, because we're going to learn some interesting things about the contrast between the way in which we view being now and the ways in which the ancient Greeks viewed it. And there'll be more information about this process of historical decline that we have experienced in the course of the history of the West. Now, right off the bat, Heidegger doesn't have much good to say about the science of linguistics. The science of linguistics as the study of language, the scientific, supposedly, study of language, including such things as syntax and semantics, the classification of different parts of speech, verb tenses, and the like, derives for Heidegger from the very ancient proto-scientific investigation, namely Greek and Latin grammars. However, for Heidegger, in comparison to what he calls a more original connection to language, what linguistics gives us is a picture of dead mechanisms, which he calls a barren wasteland. A barren wasteland. In the end, Heidegger does not believe that linguistics can tell us much at all about being, except perhaps by means of the clues that its failures inadvertently provide. Linguistics for him is a rigid, superficial, spiritless approach to language, in spite of its scientific apparatus. The fundamental problem with any scientific or technical approach to language is that it treats language as a being. Science always treats its objects as scientific objects, of course, but more generally as beings. And any grammatical or linguistic examination of language is going to treat language as just another being among beings. And for Heidegger, this approach is unable, in principle, to get at the essence of language. It overlooks the more originary connection that language has to the being of beings. So to treat language just as a being, one being among others, is to ignore the way in which language has a more originary connection to the being of beings. In language, the being of beings is spoken for Heidegger. Language speaks the being of beings. On page 59, he expresses this idea as follows. Second paragraph. The determination of the essence of language, and even the act of asking about it, regulates itself in each case according to what has become the prevailing preconception about the essence of beings and about how we comprehend essence. But essence and being speak in language. Essence and being speak in language. Skipping down to the middle of the next paragraph. What is really at issue is an essential clarification of the essence of being. An essential clarification of the essence of being, as regards its essential involvement with the essence of language. What is really at issue is an essential clarification of the essence of being as regards its essential involvement with the essence of language. In other words, we want to determine what the essential relationship is between the being of beings and the essence of language. So we have, of course, our quarry that we're seeking here, the being of beings, and then over here, the essence of language. So we ask, what is the being of beings? What is the being here that we're thinking of or speaking of? And we're asking also here about the essence of language. And the question is, what is the relationship between these two questions, if at all? Maybe there isn't one, right? But Heidegger asserts that there is one, and not just that there's a relation, but that this relation is essential. That there is an essential relation, meaning that whatever the essence of being understood here is, and the essence of language understood here is, these are going to be intelligible in terms of one another. That's what the essential relation is here. So this is a very different approach to an understanding of language from the linguistic scientific approach. The being of beings, far from being an evanescent vapor, will be shown eventually to belong in a certain way to language. The being of being belongs to language. And the essence of language, far from being the technical apparatus or set of structures that linguistics and grammar study try to make it out to be, will be revealed to belong in a certain originary way to being. Okay. So, the German word for being is das Sein. And this is a noun that's constructed out of the German word for the verbal infinitive to be, which is sein. So we have, of course, two words here in English, to be, but in German that translates just as one, sein. And then the exact same spelling is used for the verbal substantive, das Sein, which is the word for being. So the name for being is thus a noun or substantive. So that's two different ways in which grammar traditionally refers to this part of speech, the noun or the substantive. Being or das Sein in this case is a verbal substantive. It's a noun that's derivative upon a verb, that's derivative upon the infinitive. Now Heidegger asks what grammarians mean by these technical grammatical terms, noun, substantive, verb, and infinitive. He recognizes that the noun and the verb were among the first grammatical forms to be recognized by grammarians and are commonly regarded by everyone as, quote, the fundamental forms of words and of language in general, unquote. That's from page 61. A question that inevitably crops up when asking about the essence of the noun and the verb is, which is more original, or which is more primitive, which is more primordial, which came first? The noun or the verb? Which one, that is, the noun or the verb, was the original form of the word? When words originated, did they first originate as nouns or first originate as verbs? When we ask what the original form of the word was, we're at the same time asking about the original character of speech or of speaking, and thus about the origin of language. So, for example, did language originate by someone pointing? The opening of Ludwig Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations is this famous discussion where he imagines a primitive language where there are these builders and they're using slabs of stone and they point and say slab. You know, that could be a picture of the origin of language, in which case it would be the noun substantive that would be first. Or another plausible interpretation, even of this example, would be did perhaps language originate with commands, which would suggest that the verbs were the first form? You know, come, you know, those are first, or go, right? Be gone. Are those the original forms of words? That's the idea. And of course, which option you take here, or some blend of these options, is going to determine your understanding of what the original character of speech or speaking is. Is it commanding? Is it indicating? You know, what is the original character of speech or speaking in relationship to the origin of language? So, what Heidegger has in mind here then is that when we ask about the essence of the noun, what is a noun? What is a noun substantive? Or what is a verb? We're asking about the essence of these things. But we're not merely asking about the essence of these things. We're also at the same time asking about the essence of language itself. These are questions about the noun and the verb, or questions about the essence of language itself. But he no sooner makes this point than that Heidegger immediately tells us that we're not prepared yet to go into the question of the origin of language. Instead, we have to take what he calls a detour. And the detour is to examine the infinitive, which is a transitional form between the verb and the substantive. So we have the noun, the verb, and the infinitive. And Heidegger's detour is to say, before we talk about the nouns and the verbs, which pertain to the essence of language itself and questions about the origin of language, we're going to look at this one, the infinitive, the transitional form between the verb and the substantive. Why does he call it the transitional form? Well, we have the noun here, being, and then we have the verb forms, things like is, are, was, and then the infinitive form, to be. And the idea is that this is going to turn out to be a more abstract and less connected to particular actions form of linguistic structure. And we see here, of course, that this provides us with the transition to the substantive, more obvious in German than in English. But even the same is the case here in the case of English, where we add the ing onto the to be of the infinitive, drop the to. So the detour is to examine the infinitive, the transitional form, according to Heidegger, between the verb and the substantive or noun. In Heidegger's procedure for asking about the infinitive, we proceed by asking where this arose and how it developed. And this sounds like a very dry technical notion. But remember Heidegger's thesis that grammar linguistics generally derive from a philosophical basis. And so to ask a question in a philosophical spirit about grammar or the origin of grammatical ideas is to investigate the basis of their origin, which is to say to investigate the philosophical ideas that led to these grammatical concepts or that form the foundation for them. Okay, so where does the infinitive come from? It comes from Latin. It's actually a shortened term for Latin term, the modus infinitivus. So that's the Latin term from which we get the grammatical technical term infinitive, the modus infinitivus or infinitivus. I don't speak Latin, so I'm not quite sure, but I'm going to say infinitivus is probably right. And this literally means the mode. And of course, we're familiar with the concept of mode from Spinoza. The mode of unboundedness. Literally what that means. The mode of unboundedness. And you can already see from this that this actually is going to turn out to be a scientific, or if you want, proto-scientific, grammatical technical term. This term, as was the case with natura and physis, where natura, the Latin natura, translated the Greek physis from Greek into Roman philosophy. This is the translation of an earlier Greek grammatical term. So Heidegger goes into the history of this, and then we end up coming back in Heidegger's somewhat meandering course here, back to the question actually of the origin of the noun and the verb. So we drop the infinitive for a minute and go back to discussing the noun and the verb here in their origin in ancient Greek grammar. The Greeks recognized the distinction between the noun and the verb, of course, which they called the onoma and the rhema. So these are the next terms we're talking about for Heidegger. The onoma, of course, these are transliterated from the Greek alphabet. And I'm going to put these in scare quotes because Heidegger's whole point here will be to analyze the original sense and meaning these terms had for the Greeks. But the way that these are normally understood is that the onoma became the technical grammatical term for noun, derived originally from a word for name. And rima became the technical grammatical term that we would translate as verb, but originally from the word for a spoken utterance. Let's look at page 62. The development of the grammatical concepts of onoma and rima, according to Heidegger, third line down in the third paragraph, was worked out and first established in the most immediate and intimate connection with the conception and interpretation of being that has become definitive for the entire West. So as the concept of being was being developed, philosophically, these concepts in grammar were also being developed. And that, of course, indicates a way in which the essence of language and the being of beings may have been intertwined for the Greeks. Heidegger traces the development of the grammatical distinction and differentiation, really the differentiation, the separating out between onoma and rima, to Plato's dialogue, the Sophists, where we see its inception alongside the development of the Platonic interpretation of being. As Heidegger tells the story, onoma and rima originally had overlapping senses. So at the bottom of the same paragraph I was reading from earlier, he says, onoma means the linguistic naming as distinguished from the named person or thing, and it also means the speaking of a word, which was later conceived grammatically as rima. And rima in turn means the spoken word, speech. The rhetor is the speaker, the orator, who uses not only verbs but also onomata, plural of onema, in the narrower meaning of the substantive. The fact that both terms originally governed in a wide domain is important for our point that the much discussed question in linguistics of whether the noun or the verb represents the primordial form of the word is not a genuine question. This pseudo-question first arose in the context of a developed grammar rather than from a vision of the essence of language itself, in essence still free of all grammatical dissection. So to Heidegger's mind, this original overlap between the terms onoma and rima shows that the question of whether the noun or the verb was prior or more primordial in language is a pseudo-question. The noun and the verb are both equally original because originally there was not a distinction between them, except maybe one of emphasis. Onoma and rima begin to narrow their meaning with Plato to refer to the two main classes of words, nouns and verbs respectively. And then by the time you get to Aristotle, I refer you to the bottom of page 63. I'm not going to try to write out the Greek here. I'm going to have a difficult enough time just struggling to pronounce it, let alone making sure I don't misspell it. But Aristotle distinguishes between onoma as a semantikon anu chronau. That is to say, the onoma is a signifying without reference to time. And rima as a prosemanion chronon, indicating time. And Heidegger links this to the laying down of the theory of propositions. That's the basis of formal logic. So the proposition, the sort of the timeless, we spoke of this somewhat in the context of Spinoza's idea of the ideas as the modes of God, or these sort of timeless propositions that might index a time but that don't have duration. That would be the semantikon anu chronau, the signifying without reference to time. And then, so in Aristotle, we get the beginning of this idea of the proposition. And that becomes then the basis for logic, the study of logic. Logic concerns itself with propositions. So now we return to the Latin term, the modus infinitivus, or the modus infinitivus verbi, the way of the unbounded verb, or the unbounded way of the verb, the unbounded mode of the verb. Different ways we could translate that, unpack it. And Heidegger notes that this is a negative term. There's an implicit distinction here between the modus finitivus and the modus infinitivus. the bounded mode of the verb, and the unbounded mode of the verb. And of course, this is the derivative. No, the infinitive is the derivative notion, the negative, the negation of the idea of a bounded mode. The Greek prototype for the term modus is enklesis. Enklesis. So these are the Latin terms, and then the Greek term here. And literally this means an inclining or leaning to the side. An inclination, but an inclining to the side, or in the sense of a sort of a, kind of a falling away. Like think about your fence. Your fence starts to get a little old, the sandy ground underneath it begins to give way, and your fence starts to tip to the side, right? Inclining to the side. An inclination, then this gets extended then metaphorically to the inclination of a word. What does it mean for a word to be inclined? To incline a word. We know what it means for a fence to incline in this sense, but what's the inclining of the word? This inclination is the sense of what probably now is more commonly referred to as the inflection of a word. Its case, the inflected forms that reflect its relation to reflect. Did I say inflect? Reflect its relation to the other words in the sentence. For example, by changing the ending of a word. This isn't so familiar to someone who is only or primarily familiar with English, since English normally uses prepositions for this purpose. But other languages will use inflections, changes in the word ending or the form of the word, in order to indicate its relationship to other words. So those of you who've studied some other languages will have a sense of this. Case, the case in this sense, so we have the case or the inflection of the words. This derives from the Greek word ptosis, with a P. So that's the relationship here, the ptosis. It's just the enklesis, the mode, or enklesis, the inclining, the inclination. The case is the ptosis. These are sort of overlapping notions in grammar, related notions in grammar. Ptosis originally meant any kind of inflection for any type of word, but it later came to designate the inflections of nouns, while enklesis came to designate the inflection of verbs. So then, just to clean this up a little bit here, that's what we've got in Greek grammar. The enklesis is the inflection of the verbs, and the ptosis is the inflection of the nouns. And then in Latin grammars, ptosis became casus, which is in English grammars the case. That's how that transformation took place. And enklesis became declinatio in Latin. Which in English is the declination. Which will mean more to you if you are up on your study of grammar or traditional formal grammar than if you're not. But anyway, that's what we're talking about here, this section of the chapter. Next, Heidegger asks how these two terms, ptosis and enklesis, came into use in the examination of language and its inflections. And as we said before, in grammatical analysis, language is taken as one being among others. Language is approached in the way that one would study a plant's organs or a rock formation or an animal skeleton. If that is the case, then we can ask the question, how is the being of language understood? Heidegger takes for granted that the way the Greeks understood and defined the being of beings in general must have somehow made itself felt in their conception of language. Because this grammatical conception of language sees language as one being among other beings. So whatever the general understanding was of the being of beings in general would also have applied to language. In other words, the very definite understanding of being that came to define the West led to a very definite understanding of the nature of language as well. First, there's the way that the Greek understanding of being made itself felt in the terms tosis and inclisis. On page 65, he says, third paragraph, the terms tosis and inclisis mean a falling, tipping, or inclining, as we already said. A falling, tipping, or inclining. This implies a dropping off from an upright, straight stance. But this standing there, this taking and maintaining a stand that stands erected high in itself, is what the Greeks understood as being. So the being of being for the Greeks is this coming to a stand, standing upright in itself. In comparison, in relation to this, these ideas of inclisis and tosis originally came from an interpretation of language as a falling away, as a tipping off from the standing of being. That's what he's saying. This idea of being as maintaining as a stand points to two additional Greek terms, namely the terms paros, meaning the self-constraining limit that brings beings to a stand, the self-constraining limit that brings beings to a stand. That is the Greek term paros under Heidegger's interpretation. And then telos, which is the coming to fulfillment of a being. And there's a relationship between these terms, paros and telos, because the coming to fulfillment of a being for Heidegger is the coming to fulfillment as it reaches its limit, as it were, reaches its appropriate limits or bounds. So that's part of the meaning here. The coming to fulfillment of a being as it reaches its limit. To this, Heidegger adds two more terms, namely morphe, the shape, and eidos, which, of course, we understand as the form or idea typically. But Heidegger understands this as the look. And we fill these ideas out further as follows: the morphe, the shape, and the eidos, or the look. On page 66. So on morphe, he says, whatever places itself into and thereby enacts its limit and thus stands has shape, morphe. The essence of shape, as understood by the Greeks, comes from the emergent placing itself forth into the limit. So the coming to fulfillment, the telos, in a self-constraining limit that brings to a stand, or paros, takes the form of form, shape, or morphe. So that's the relationship between these things. The paros, the self-constraining limit, that things they come to stand, they emerge into being, they come to a stand when they reach their self-constraining limit, then they are coming to fulfillment, that is, they achieve their telos in their distinctive shape, which is their own distinctive self-constraining limit, their morphe. That's the relationship between these things. There's a sort of description of a process or a succession that he's got in mind here. So where does the eidos come in? Remember that morphe is going to be one of the Greek words that we have often translated as form, and the other is eidos, which is also translated traditionally as idea. Page 66, continuing on where I left off before. But from an observer's point of view, what stands there in itself becomes what puts itself forth, what offers itself, and how it looks. The Greeks call the look of a thing its eidos, or idea. Initially, there resonates in the word eidos an overtone of what even we mean when we say, the thing looks fine. It looks presentable. It's solid. The thing hits the mark. The thing fits. It rests in its appearing. That is, in the coming forth of its essence. So this look is a kind of look of fittingness, as we might describe it. And this contains a kind of relativity to an observer. The shape is the thing coming into the fulfillment of its telos in itself. And the eidos is the relation of the morphe, the shape, to an observer who observes the shape and sees that it fits. The eidos, the form or the idea, is the look of fittingness of a thing that has arrived at its shape and has come to a stand in it, in its self-made limit. Western metaphysics, of course, has become accustomed to think of the being with a form as a substance. But Heidegger is once again critical of such a thoughtless, Latinized translation of the Greek as substantia, from which we get the English substance. So, continuing on page 66, he says, what grounds and holds together all the determinations of being we have listed is what the Greeks experience without question as the meaning of being, which they called ousia, or more fully, parousia. The usual thoughtlessness translates ousia as substance, and thereby misses its sense entirely. Skipping down a bit to the end of the paragraph, he says, in ousia, something comes to presence. It stands in itself and thus puts itself forth. It is. For the Greeks, being fundamentally means presence. For the Greeks, being fundamentally means presence. So the idea is that you have this term ousia, which more conventional translators would just describe as thing, even as sort of stuff, as like your think in terms of a merchant's stock of items to sell. That would be a common use of the term ousia. Your things. But what he says is that this means, ousia means parousia, and that this is a matter of coming to presence. And you see the internal connection between this characterization and the description that we just went through earlier of these other Greek terms as they describe the Greek understanding of being. Now, on this term, parousia, there's a rich Christian tradition surrounding this word that Heidegger doesn't mention here. This is the word in the Gospels in the early fathers for the coming of Christ. The parousia, the coming to presence here, became the word for the coming into our presence of God, the coming of Christ. and especially the second coming, so-called, was the Parusia. So you have a problem in theology of the famous problem called the delay of the Parusia, which is why is the second coming? Why hasn't it happened yet? And what implications does it not having happened have for Christianity? But when the creed says we believe that he will come again, this is Parusia. And also for traditional, that is to say pre-1517 Christians, traditional Christians at least, the Parusia refers to the coming to presence of Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist. But for Heidegger, the word for coming to presence or parousia is crucial, most notably as the master term for the Greek understanding of being as presence. That's what he's saying now. The master understanding of being is presence. And this immediately, of course, raises the question of the relationship between being as parousia or ousia or presence and being as phusis or the self-emerging abiding sway, which we saw earlier was supposed to be the Greek understanding of being. So apparently it's both parousia and phusis, but that immediately raises the question of how these two relate to each other, being as presence and being as emerging, abiding sway. So evidently for the Greeks, it means both. These are not, obviously Heidegger doesn't mean to contradict himself here. Being is understood fundamentally as presence, and being is understood fundamentally as emerging, abiding sway. The sway here is to be understood as presence, and in particular as what he describes as the overwhelming coming to presence, the overwhelming coming to presence. And this overwhelmingness of the sway, the sway is the overwhelming coming to presence. This is, or consists of, its being not being yet conquered by thinking. That is, its presence cannot be readily assimilated to a concept or a proposition. It also turns out that this sway has an internal connection to a key Heideggerian conception of truth, which also is internally related to the conception of being, namely truth as aletheia, or unconcealment. Truth as aletheia or unconcealment, that also is going to pertain to this idea of being as sway. How? Well, in this concept of truth as aletheia or unconcealment, truth is understood as something that happens. The unconcealment contains an evident allusion to an act or a happening. Something is unconcealed. Think of the unveiling of a public work of art or of a new concept automobile by Tesla or something like that. The veil is taken off, right? It's a happening. This is a happening. It's an event. So truth is conceived here as something which happens, in which being discloses itself or comes out of its enclosure, becomes unconcealed. Heidegger refers to the sway as what struggles itself forth as world. Sway struggles itself forth as world. World, in this sense, means a surrounding, encompassing network of meaningful intelligibility that accompanies the sway, or perhaps is constituted by it. This notion of sway, it's worth mentioning, translates the German word Wollten. And there's another word, violence, that is here translated in terms of strife or striving, which of course can't help but remind us of Spinoza's conatus, or the essential principle of striving of all modes of God for Spinoza. And this is Gewalt. So there's a etymological connection between the words here that are being translated as sway and strife or striving, which would normally be a word that would normally be translated as violence or perhaps force in German. And you can see the connection there between Wollten and Gewalt, the sense of both of them having a root of Walt. So the sway, this suggests, involves a violence in the form of a strife or a striving. So think about holding sway. Something holds sway often through violence. Some people or a tribe holds sway in a certain geographical area. It controls the area, it dominates the area through the use or threat of violence. Sort of a connotation here. Heidegger also introduces this notion in connection with a quote from Heraclitus that is normally taken at least to allude to war. So you have the fragment on page 67 in Greek, and he glosses this by saying, this is his translation actually, not a gloss. So on the bottom there, they have the more conventional translation, and I'll read that first. So here's the translation from Heraclitus. War is the father of all and the king of all, and it has shown some as gods and others as human beings, made some slaves and others free. War is the father of all and the king of all. But Heidegger interprets this in a different way, not in terms of war exactly, or what we usually think of as war. He says in his translation, confrontation is indeed for all that comes to presence, the sire, the Lord, who lets emerge. So confrontation is the Lord that lets all that comes to presence emerge. All that comes to presence, which of course for the Greek is all that is, because being is understood as coming to presence. So all that is emerges and comes to presence in a presence that holds sway through confrontation, through struggle and strife, in the sense of Gewalt. There's strife and striving, struggle. Probably better to put it this way, since these are the ways Heidegger understands this term. So the sway comes to be through a struggle or a striving or strife. That's the point. The Palemos named here, which is translated often as war, so you have Palemos. Which would usually be translated as war, but the Heidegger here in this translation is describing as a confrontation, or as a struggle. Out of which those things that emerge into presence emerge. For him, this term Palemos is a strife that holds sway. It's not war. A strife that holds sway before everything divine and human, not war in the human sense. As Heraclitus thinks that struggle, first and foremost, allows what essentially unfolds to step apart from each other in opposition. First allows position and status and rank to establish themselves in coming to presence. And that purpose and status and rank here isn't so much a matter of who gets to be the king, who's the general in an army or something like that, or a government, but rather it's the sense of the meaning of things. Look around you in your house or apartment. Not everything has equal importance to you, right? There's things of different ranks. your cat lying on the bed is more important than the bed. The bed, however, is more important than, the crumbs that may have fallen off your kitchen table, right? That's the sense of rank, I think, here. The intelligibility that creates a world by ordering things in terms of their ranks or their degrees of importance and relevance. The connection between a struggle or strife and unconcealment or disclosure and truth is that the former, struggle, strife, allows for the opposition and hence the separation of the latter. Unconcealment, disclosure involves a separation of things. So your world gets set up when the world ceases to be an undifferentiated mass of things. We might use here an image of in the early morning when you're awakened, for example, by your cat at 4 in the morning, it's still pitch dark. And for a moment, there is no world. It's just an undifferentiated mass of things in your house or apartment. And then gradually things begin to emerge, right? You're sort of sleeping. Maybe you just unconsciously search for your slippers or whatever. You're following the cat. But you're still groggy and you kind of, you can't originally distinguish like where's the pantry where the cat food is versus, which direction is the bathroom, and then gradually things, separate from each other, right? There's undifferentiated mass and there's a separation, there's a disclosure. It gives you a rough idea. Heidegger, though, of course, is imagining here much more, I think, primordial happening. It's not really clear what he's imagining, but there's room for different interpretations of this. But that'll give you at least a first blush sort of grasp of this. This opposition or this separating he describes also as the cleft. The cleft, which is a stepping apart. The cleft is a stepping apart or an interval or a joint. It's these separations between beings that allow the ordering of rank and the relevance of the significance of things to emerge. Because if there wasn't a cleft, there would be no separation. That's the idea. So rather than being divisive, this so-called war isn't really a war, right? Palemos here is not being understood by Heraclitus, according to Heidegger's reading, as war, but rather as this kind of confrontation or struggle that leads to a separating of things. Rather than being divisive, this war produces or builds unity. It makes the world intelligible. I have to struggle to be able to get out of bed to find the food to feed my cat. My cat has to struggle to get me out of bed by harassing me until I get out of bed. And then, of course, the food is something that the cat has to, in a certain sense, struggle, has to work to be able to consume, right? The cat just can't lie down and get nourished by the food, has to chew and so on. That's the struggle. But what all emerges from all of this is an intelligible world. It's a kind of unity. This is our morning routine, right? This gives my world sense and meaning. It gives me literally a reason to get out of bed in the morning in this struggle. And that's the way the world is. Everything's a struggle. Producing this video is the outcome of a struggle. It's a struggle to continue talking about this stuff, right? It's a struggle for you to listen to it. So rather than being divisive, this struggle produces unity. And so turns out that there's an unexpected interconnection between the Palemos, the war, the strife, and the logos, which is this, of course, great Greek philosophical and spiritual catch-all term that can be translated as everything from word to reason. But here Heidegger is thinking of it as the unity, as the systematic principle or unity that unites things in the world. So it's a struggle that gathers and unifies. And this, he says, is authentic history on page 68. The struggle meant here is originary struggle, for it allows those that struggle to originate as such in the first place. It is not a mere assault on the present at hand. Struggle first projects and develops the unheard of, the hitherto unsaid and unthought. And this is why I said my homely examples are almost certainly too superficial. They're meant just to give you a kind of first blush understanding of what Heidegger might be getting at. But there's a deeper primordial struggle out of which beings originally emerge into their presence. The struggle is then sustained by the creators, by the poets, by the thinkers, and the statesmen. The great men, the creators, the poets, the thinkers, and the statesmen are the ones who bring being into presence, right? So this is this deeper, more primordial sense here that goes far deeper than me feeding food to my cat. Against the overwhelming sway, they, namely the great men, throw the counterweight of their work and capture in this work the world that is thereby opened up. Very sort of heroic, romantic conception here of the great creative thinkers and poets and so on. He throws the statesman here as well, right? So the truth that happens, the coming into presence, the disclosure, the unconcealment, the aletheia, the truth that happens doesn't just happen. It is sort of ushered in by these great men. With these works, the works of the great men, the sway, phusis, back to the interpretation of phusis as sway, first comes to a stand in what comes to presence. Being as such, rather beings as such, now first come into being. This becoming a world is authentic history. It goes on to say then that when this struggle ceases, you end up with just objects and things and a kind of banal, hollowed out relationship to being. The picture is of a certain dynamism in being that can be lost, that beings can become mere objects. Even a kind of animism. I mean, you get the picture of beings having a kind of internal life to them, which can be lost when the understanding of being becomes purely technological and beings come to be seen as mere objects. I think a good example here would be the work of art, because these are still things that I think many people can experience something like an animism in the thing. Consider when you first encounter something amazing in a museum. I mean, it can seem to shimmer and to oscillate in itself, to have a kind of life to it. It can seem to be a supposedly quote-unquote material object that is alive and that contains this kind of struggle within it. But then you go out of the museum, on your way out, of course, there's always the gift shop, and you see it on a postcard or a wallpaper for your, computer screen or something like that, or your phone. That's the diminution of this life into the mere status of an object, a kind of degeneration. It represents a degeneration of phusis, which Heidegger describes on page 69, where he says, the originally emergent self-upraising of the violent forces of what holds sway, the phanesthai is appearing in the broad sense of the epiphany of a world, that's phanesthai is the appearing, now becomes reduced to the demonstrable visibility of present at hand things. The eye, the seeing, which once viewed the project into the sway in an originary viewing and produced the work while seeing into the sway, has now been reduced to a mere observing and inspecting and staring. The look is now only the optical. So, there's a kind of catch-22 here. If Heidegger's right, we should find it difficult to understand what he's getting at, because according to him, our relationship to being has so degenerated that we tend to see things as just, present-to-hand objects, things to be manipulated and controlled, and we've lost this sort of more vital, dynamic relationship to beings and the being of beings that's going on in them. Beings remain, but being has deserted them. So being now becomes for Heidegger constancy. For the Greeks, he says, being spoke of a constancy in a twofold sense. Standing in itself, as arising and standing forth, that's, of course, phusis, and as such, enduringly, abidingly. And that is ousia, or presence. So that's how phusis and ousia, or this emerging, abiding sway and presence, relate to one another. If being has a sense of constancy, then what is non-being? Inconstancy? Well, almost, but not quite. Heidegger calls it a step out of such constancy. It is existanti, or existence. Existasti, or existence. Excuse my pronunciation. Existence is standing out of, standing out from. This, of course, is ironic because we associate existence with being rather than non-being, but existence is sort of a standing out of this constancy. The fact that we associate existence with being is, for Heidegger, just another sign of our alienation from being. So this leads us to our first discussion question. In the passages that we've just read, Heidegger employs a creative, hermeneutical, or poetical deep reading of certain Greek words to reconstruct the ancient Greek supposed lived experience or phenomenology of being, which was supposedly preserved in a kind of fossilized form in these ancient words, according to him. In your own words, how would you compare Heidegger's phenomenological picture of the being of beings, as experienced by the Greeks, to the typical modern experience of reality? Where do you see continuity and where divergence in the way that we speak of being and the way that the Greeks spoke of being? In your own words, how would you describe the overall impression of being that Heidegger's reading of these Greek words gives to you, which resonate with you and which are difficult to digest? So, to boil that down, the basic idea is, how would you compare this Greek experience of being, the being of beings, with our understanding of beings? What is the overall impression that what we just covered in Heidegger gives you? Does this conception resonate with you? Or what do you find it difficult to digest? And if so, in which aspects specifically? Okay, so this brings us back to our two grammatical words for case and declination, the inclination of nouns and verbs, tosis and inclisis. These designate the inclining, we said, or the falling away from the standing that constitutes being. Heidegger can now say that after this analysis. So the tosis and inclisis, the declination of language, is the falling away from this constancy. The falling away from the constancy. The inclining, like the falling, the leaning fence, right, is the falling or inclining away from the constancy of being. In other words, language for the Greeks is understood as this kind of departing from the constancy of the stand, a decline. Now, language is conceived as something in being and therefore as constant. What is constant is that it shows itself, and this means that it shows itself primarily to seeing or to sight. Thus, language is conceived as something that shows itself to sight, which is, in linguistic terms, the written word. So language for the Greeks was the written word, Heidegger says. It is what is spoken that comes to a stand. In the act of talking, by contrast, language drifts away from this constancy into something impermanent, the spoken language. So grammata then, grammar, is the study of the written sign in language, because it's that written sign that is the constancy of language, which is the understanding of being. And thus the grammatical way became the standard way of viewing and studying language. According to the grammatical way of looking at things, there are basic forms of the written word, and there are deviations or inflections of these basic forms. So he says, this is on page 71, the basic position of the noun, the substantive, is the nominative singular. For example, ho kulos, the circle. The basic position of the verb is the first person singular present indicative. For example, lego, I say. The infinitive, in contrast, is a particular modus verbi and inclisis. Of what sort? This is what we must now determine. It is best to do this with an example. One form of lego is lexanto. They, the men in this case, could be called and addressed as traders, for example. This inflection consists more precisely in the forms making manifest another person, the third person, another number, not the singular but the plural, another voice, the passive instead of the active, another tense, another mood. What is named in the word lexianto is not addressed as actually present in hand, but rather represented as only possibly in being. The inflected form of the word makes all of this manifest in addition and lets it be understood immediately. To make something else manifest in addition, to allow it to arise and be seen in addition, this is the function of the inclisis, in which the word that stands straight inclines to the side. This is why it is called inclisis par emphatikos. The descriptive word par emphano is used generally according to the fundamental relation of the Greeks to being as what is constant. The key point here is that the inclined form, or the declination of the verb, allows something else to be manifested, allows it to be to arise and to be seen in addition. That's what an inclisis is. An inclisis allows something else to be manifested, to arise and to be seen in addition. To allow something else to be manifested, to arise and be seen in addition. And that's why it's called an inclisis par emphatikos, the inclining of a word that lets something else appear in addition. So this, a par emphatikos is just a kind of commentary, so to speak, on inclisis. The inclining of a word that lets something else appear in addition. Inclining lets something else appear in addition. Heidegger follows this by talking about the appearance of this word in the context of the discussion of the chora, or the spacing, the space or the spacing in which that which comes appears. So the chora is this space that allows something to appear. This is a fascinating notion. There's a lot that can be said about this, but we lack the time, so I'm going to go over this rather lightly. But the point here is that the chora is a par emphinon, an appearing with that allows other things to appear by withdrawing. It withdraws in order to allow something else to arise, to be manifest. And the upshot of all of this is that Heidegger wants to emphasize how the Greek understanding of language, in the Greek understanding of language, the word had this character of being a par emphinon. That it allows something else. to be manifested. Allows something else to be manifested. That's the basic character of language. Heidegger says on page 73, a word as such is a word to the extent that it lets shine forth. It lets something else shine forth in it. And this leads us to our second discussion question. How would you compare and contrast the grammar-based understanding of language that sees it as an object of scientific analysis and classification, one object among others, with the understanding of language as a pair infinon that lets beings be seen, that lets them shine forth? What metaphysical assumptions about being lead to and derive from these two approaches to language? So once again, second discussion question, how would you compare and contrast the grammar-based understanding of language that sees it as an object of scientific analysis and classification, one object among others, with the understanding of language as a parum finon that lets beings be seen, lets shine forth? What metaphysical assumptions about being lead to and derive from these two approaches of language? Okay, so to wrap this up, the infinitive that we were talking about earlier, the modus infinitivus, is a kind of enklesis a para emphaticos. So we have the enklesis para emphaticos that lets other things be manifest lets them be seen. The modus infinitivus is to be understood in terms of a pure limitation that doesn't let other things be seen, that isolates and abstracts the verb, making it into a pure formality, as opposed to a being that withdraws to allow being to manifest itself. That's the main contrast. Language has this power, words have the power of letting things shine forth. The infinitive form is, as it were, a contraction of language into itself. And it is, in fact, itself a construct of grammar that lets things, that lets the verb sort of stand in itself apart from things. So it's not letting things be seen anymore. Thus, the infinitive form of the verb is the most formal, abstract, and emptiest form. It's the most formal, abstract, and emptiest form. When we make the additional move of transforming this abstract, empty infinitive form into a substantive, a noun, transforming in English to be into being, or sein into Dasein in German, this represents a further blurring of the meaning of being. And Heidegger addresses this on page 76. And he suggests that, just to kind of paraphrase him here, that in this, we've sort of transformed being itself into a being. To say das Sein suggests that being itself is merely a being. To speak of being is to reduce, at least verbally, being to the status of an object, which totally misses its character. So that's the kind of degeneration that goes through grammar when the word being comes to emerge through the history of these grammatical forms. Okay, very quickly, the three stem words that Heidegger ends with. I won't bother to write these down. You can see these on pages 78 and 79. S, bu, and ves. The three stem words for Indo-Germanic language about being derive from words originally meaning life, living, that which comes from out of itself and stands and goes and reposes, what comes to emerge, to hold sway, and what dwells, abides, or sojourns, or presences. That's Heidegger's analysis. And the big question for Heidegger now is, how are these three stems unified? And that remains for Heidegger at the end of this discussion a question. We don't get the answers from the etymological analysis of being any more than we get them from a grammatical analysis of the verbal substantive being.